What's up, makers? It's Jen with Minerva. I think patterns have endless potential when you want to reimagine them. Today, I thought I would use the Simplicity 8657 pattern and create 3 separate looks using 3 completely different fabrics. All right, let's get sewing. Today, I'm going to be working with the Simplicity 8657 pattern. I'm really excited to be working with this. This is just a really great base pattern that we can kind of really do whatever we want with. And it is sized extra small through 2XL. And the chest goes up to 48 inches and the hip says it goes up to 50. But when I measured the pattern, the finished hip is actually 62 inches and the bust is 61. So there's definitely quite a bit of ease built into this pattern. So I think it opens up the sizing quite a bit. I had the idea to use this Simplicity pattern and create a really just fun top that uses kind of the basic outline that the pattern already has and adding some channeling and some fabric strips to kind of create this ruching gathered look along the front and back center seam and the shoulder seams at the sleeve. I'm going to be using this really fun, colorful Lady McElroy Marley cotton lawn print. It's really super cool. It's so bright, so colorful. It has a really soft hand. It does have a little bit of stiffness, just like any lawn, but it's super soft. To get started, I need to pull out my front and back pattern pieces so that I can trace off the pattern to make the subtle pattern adjustments. So I have my front piece here, and it's actually the front and the sleeve. It's all in one piece. And I am going to get some paper and use my tracing wheel, and I'm going to just be marking which pattern I need and marking it along my paper. I went ahead and marked off the front of the pattern that I needed on some brown paper. So all I did was place my tissue paper on top of some brown paper and I traced around, and then I came back in and used a ruler and pencil to true up my lines and make sure that they were nice and straight. So because most of these patterns come with existing seam allowance, this one was marked at 5/8 of a seam allowance, I went ahead and marked my seam allowance here and all over the pattern. So I didn't do anything too crazy with the front. It is almost identical to what the pattern is, and I used the longer line on the pattern front for my shirt. And then I made sure that I had seam allowance at the center front because I'm going to have that center front seam that has the ruched channeling in there. That piece also has a long kind of deep V neckline. I didn't want that for this top. I wanted it to be able to kind of stay up on my shoulders a little bit better, so I decided to raise the neckline. A good rule of thumb for a back neckline is typically somewhere between 3/4 of an inch to 2 inches for kind of a neckline depth. So I took a straight line out and I measured down 2 inches, and then I created a curved line and I added 3/8 of a seam allowance here. So we did not stitch up the center front seam, and that's because there's kind of a deep V neckline here, and that just gets tricky when we're utilizing kind of a binding around that V. So I always like to use the seam as kind of a way to finish off the binding. So I created a 3/4 inch binding strip. This particular one is not cut on the bias. So you could cut it on the bias. I tend to not. I find them extra finicky and you don't necessarily need the give that bias will lend. So I kind of randomly cut a strip along with my 24-inch strips for my ruching pieces. And so I created 2 strips that are 24 inches as well. I wanted to put the seam at the center back. So I'm gonna go here towards my center back. I kind of have it marked already. And I'm gonna be placing that back binding seam along there. And then I'm just gonna kind of hand measure all the way over and start my binding piece along the front edge. I wanna follow the kind of slanted line of the neckline and not necessarily this folded back piece. So I'm going to be going to my machine and I'm going to be stitching at 1/4 inch all the way around the neckline. Once I do that, I'm going to flip this up and I'm going to be understitching, which means we're going to be flipping the seam allowance under the binding and we're going to be stitching at about 1/8 of an inch along this edge of this binding piece all the way around the neckline. As you can see, I stitched on this binding and then I understitched along the edge of the binding itself while turning the seam allowance towards the binding itself. So now we're going to do the second steps to these. So that means we're going to be folding this again. If you want to press this step, you can hop on over to the iron and fold and press this down. I tend to do it all in one step. I just fold this and then flip it again towards the wrong side of the fabric. And then I stitch down along the other edge of the binding. And then when you're finished, you'll have this nice clean edge along your neckline. And you can see that even though I didn't cut these on the bias, the curve of this neckline isn't super severe. So this still laid flat and I didn't have to fight with turning a bias cut binding. Sometimes they can be quite ornery and finicky. I am going to be making a cropped jacket using this Simplicity 8657 pattern. I am going to be making the main jacket out of this teddy faux fur in the rose pink. It's a really soft and fluffy, just kind of like a teddy bear. And then because I don't want to add any lining to my jacket, I wanted a really nice seam finishing. So I'm going to be using this Marley Cotton Lawn by Lady McElroy. And I'm going to just be making some binding pieces to have some bound edges on the interior of my jacket. So let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about how I created my pattern for this jacket. So I really only used the front and sleeve piece for the pattern. The front and back pieces to this are very, very similar. So I went ahead and just utilized one for consistency, and then I had to make less pattern pieces. So as you can see, I'm going to line up my pattern piece here so that you can kind of tell where I made my changes. So as you can see, I wanted to raise up this neckline. I did not want something so plunging since this was going to be a jacket. So I lifted up my neckline by a few inches, and that's really, I kind of took this point and measured down about 4 inches, which is sort of a standard neck drop for a front neck. And then I created my sleeve. I didn't want this to be a giant pattern piece and be difficult to fit on my fabric. So I went ahead and created a raglan sleeve seam here. Really all I did for this, since I don't really need any kind of basic arm shaping, was just a straight line across, and then I matched it here against my sleeve, and then I drew a straight line all the way out so that it was the length from my shoulder all the way to my wrist. And this was the beginning of my shoulder at my neckline all the way down to my wrist. And I added a little extra room just in case, just once kind of your arm drops. And a little forgiveness just in case I want it to be a little bit longer. I can always make it shorter if I want, but it's really difficult once this is cut to make it longer. So in addition to these two pieces, I went ahead and also made a front facing. So I have my front facing piece that's going to fit along here. And then I have my back neck facing piece as well. These front and back pieces are going to be cut the same. So I'm using the same pattern piece for my front and for my back. My back pieces, I plan to cut this line on the fold, whereas I don't need to do that for my front pieces. Same for my facing. I am going to put this on the fold and cut as well. Wanted to show you how I was going to finish off the seams inside of this jacket. I created just some simple quarter bias pieces, and so quarter bias just means I didn't fully cut it on the bias, so it still has a little bit of stretch, but I was able to cut in kind of a smaller area and get longer strips because I wasn't quite on the bias. It's just a little trick that I've used for years. So I sewed these together with right angles and then pressed open the seams, and then we're going to be doing a bound edge on this seam, on all of our seams, so that each edge is finished. So I went ahead and stitched on this bias piece, and I stitched 1/4 inch all the way down. And you can do this one of two ways. A bound hem is, or a bound seam finish is actually one that turns it under again and over so that both sides are finished. You can also do what's called a Hong Kong seam, which means it's stitched on one side and it's finished along the edge, and then this just wraps over and tucks under. And this is a little long for this particular, for a Hong Kong finish. I would need to trim this off because you would want this to be within the seam allowance. But this edge is typically left raw and not turned under again. So double turn would be bound and a flat would be a Hong Kong. If you were using a particularly thicker fabric for this bound edge, that might be why you would want to use a Hong Kong finish versus a bound, but I'm going to go ahead and do a bound finish for this. So I'm going to turn this, and then I'm going to stitch along the edge. You can either stitch in the ditch or you can stitch on top. I'm going to go ahead and stitch on top. So I went ahead and did that for my other sleeve, just so you guys could see what it looks like. And I just have it tucked underneath here and then stitched on top. And I did that on both sides of my seam allowance. You could potentially do this all together and have it on one piece versus open. I just like the look of this, and I think it makes it kind of fun once the jacket gets open. So I decided to do an open seam for this. For this project, I'm going to still be using the 8657 Simplicity pattern, and I'm going to be creating a really kind of fun color blocked dress, kind of a caftan style dress. So for this one, I'm going to be using the viscose wool in salmon and the viscose wool in russet. And it's just going to be it's going to make a really beautiful kind of flowy caftan, and I'm super excited to see how this turns out. Let's talk about what I did for my pattern. So as you can see, there is some seaming along the shoulder and the 2 seams here on the center front. So I went ahead and made these pattern pieces, and then I'm going to be using the same pattern pieces for the front as well as the back. So let's show you. I have my right front and right back. They're a little large, but they go together with the seam down the center. So that's going to be this side and this piece with the seam down the center. Then I have my left side, and I have 3 pieces on that side. So I have my top shoulder piece, my center piece, and then my bottom piece. And I made sure to list what color I was going to be cutting these in, just to make sure I wasn't confused and that I didn't get them mixed up and accidentally cut something wrong. So this one I have listed as salmon, this one as russet, and then this bottom one as salmon as well. And I went ahead and marked the other pieces as well. In addition to these pieces, I just want to cut a short binding piece that I can fit along my front and back necklines. And it's just going to be a real simple kind of binding technique that I do on this neckline just to give it kind of a nice clean finish. It's the same one that I did on the ruched shirt as well. It's just my favorite kind of binding to do. All right, let's get cutting. Everything cut out, and I did cut 2 of everything because I'm going to be using the same pieces for the front and the back, so I really needed 2 of everything. I also am going to be using Gutermann thread color 730. It's pretty much an identical match to this russet color, and I'm using the same thread color throughout. I don't want to be switching up thread colors every other step, so using the same thread the entire step. I've decided I want to do French seams along all of my seams. So to do that, we are going to stitch up our first seam with wrong sides together. This particular fabric has pretty much 2 right sides, so I made sure that this was facing the right way. And so I stitched this at 1/4 of an inch. Now we're going to just trim this off. And you don't want to trim too close to your seam. You want to leave about 1/8 of an inch. Now we're going to take this over to the iron and we will press this seam flat, and then we will come in, fold this again, and we will stitch again at 1/4 of an inch so that we totally enclose this raw edge within our seam. So I went ahead and did it on another seam so that you could see it. And this is kind of what it looks like when it is finished.